At 47, Michael Carter believed his best years were behind him. After more than 2 decades working for the same company, he was suddenly laid off during a corporate restructuring. The severance money didn't last long. His savings began disappearing month after month, and for the first time in his adult life, Michael found himself waking up every morning without a clear plan for the future. Then a phone call changed everything. His elderly uncle had passed away. The two had never been especially close, and Michael was surprised to learn that he had inherited the only thing his uncle left behind: an old general store. Not a thriving business, not valuable land, not a hidden fortune. Just a dusty, aging store sitting at the edge of a nearly forgotten town. Most of his relatives wanted nothing to do with it. Several locals told him the building wasn't worth repairing. One man even laughed and said the store had been dying for years. But while cleaning a locked office in the back of the building, Michael discovered something nobody expected: a ledger. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary accounting book, until he realized thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared from the store's profits every single year for nearly 40 years. The money hadn't been stolen, it had been given away. And the deeper Michael investigated the names written inside that ledger, the more he uncovered a secret that would change how an entire town remembered the man they thought they knew. Before we go back to the day Michael first unlocked the door to the old general store, let me know down in the comments, where are you listening from today? And what time is it where you are right now? I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach. And if you enjoy small-town mysteries, hidden family secrets, inspiring second chances, and unforgettable endings, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin. Michael Carter stared at the cardboard box sitting on his kitchen table. It wasn't very large. A framed certificate, 2 coffee mugs, a company jacket, and a handful of office supplies filled most of the space. 23 years of work, reduced to a box he could carry with one hand. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. 3 months had passed since the layoff, yet some mornings he still expected to wake up and drive to work. Instead, he spent his days scrolling through job listings and sending applications that rarely received replies. At 47, he had imagined life looking very different. He wasn't supposed to be starting over. The small apartment felt unusually quiet. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Inside, unpaid bills occupied one corner of the table. Michael looked away from them. He had become very good at looking away from things lately. His phone rang just after noon. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, he would have ignored it, assuming it was another telemarketer. Something made him answer. "Michael Carter?" a voice asked. "Speaking. My name is Susan Whitmore. I'm calling regarding the estate of your uncle, Raymond Carter." Michael sat up slightly. Uncle Raymond. The name immediately brought back childhood memories. A tall man with rough hands and a constant smell of coffee and sawdust. He owned a general store in a small town nearly 4 hours away. Michael hadn't seen him in years. Life had become busy. Calls became less frequent. Visits stopped altogether. "I'm sorry to inform you that your uncle passed away last month," Susan said gently. Michael closed his eyes. He wasn't shocked. Raymond had been in his 80s. Still, hearing the words left an unexpected ache. "I understand," Michael said quietly. "Your uncle left instructions regarding his property. You're listed as the primary beneficiary." Michael blinked. "Me?" "Yes." The attorney explained the details. Most of it sounded routine until she mentioned the store. The old general store had been left entirely to him. Michael nearly laughed. He hadn't inherited money. He hadn't inherited investments. He had inherited an aging building in a town he barely remembered. After the call ended, he sat silently for several minutes. Then curiosity got the better of him. He searched online for the store. The results weren't encouraging. The last photograph showed faded paint, cracked windows, and a nearly empty parking lot. One review from 2 years earlier simply said, "Nice place, but feels like it's disappearing." 3 days later, Michael found himself driving along a narrow country highway surrounded by farmland. The farther he traveled, the more isolated the landscape became. Small towns appeared and disappeared. Old barns leaned beside fields. Time seemed slower there. Eventually, a weathered sign appeared beside the road. "Welcome to Millfield. Population 1,203. Michael immediately remembered why he hadn't visited often. Millfield sat far from everything. The town consisted of a few blocks of brick storefronts, a church, a gas station, and not much else. Yet despite its size, the place felt strangely familiar. His uncle's store stood near the edge of town. The building looked exactly like the photograph. Maybe worse. The wooden sign above the entrance had faded considerably. Several display windows were covered with dust. One side of the porch sagged slightly. Michael parked across the street and stared at it. "Well," he muttered, "this is depressing." A voice behind him answered immediately. "You should have seen it 5 years ago." Michael turned. An older man stood nearby holding a bag of groceries. White beard, suspenders, friendly eyes. "Excuse me." The man pointed toward the store. "Used to be the busiest place in town." He extended a hand. "Walter Jennings." Michael shook it. "Michael Carter." Walter smiled. "Raymond's nephew." It wasn't a question. Michael laughed. "Is everyone here psychic?" "Small town." Walter shrugged. "News travels faster than electricity." The old man looked toward the store. His smile faded slightly. "Your uncle was a good man." Michael nodded politely. He wasn't sure what else to say. Walter eventually headed home, but not before offering one final piece of advice. "Don't rush to sell it." Michael frowned. "Why would you say that?" Walter glanced toward the building. "Because most people only saw the store." Then he walked away. The comment lingered in Michael's mind. Most people only saw the store. What exactly was that supposed to mean? A short time later, he unlocked the front door for the first time. A bell above the entrance jingled softly. The smell hit him immediately. Old wood, coffee, dust, memories. The interior looked frozen in time. Shelves still held merchandise. Old advertisements decorated the walls. A wooden counter stretched across one side of the room. Michael slowly walked through the store. Every corner seemed connected to childhood visits. He remembered helping Raymond stock shelves, sweeping floors, carrying boxes he was barely strong enough to lift. For a moment, the years between then and now seemed to disappear. Then reality returned. The place needed work, a lot of work. He spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring. Most rooms contained exactly what he expected: storage areas, inventory, office supplies. Nothing unusual. Then he reached a narrow hallway behind the counter. 3 doors sat along one wall. The first opened into a supply room. The second led to a small break area. The third wouldn't open at all. Michael tried again. Locked. Curious. He examined the handle. Dust covered most surfaces nearby, but the lock looked relatively clean. as if someone had used it more recently. He frowned. Why would an office inside an abandoned store remain locked? More importantly, where was the key? He searched nearby drawers without success. Eventually, he gave up and returned to the front of the building. The sun was already beginning to set. Long shadows stretched across the floorboards. Before leaving, Michael looked back toward the locked office one last time. Something about it bothered him. Not because it was locked, because it felt intentional. Raymond had never been a secretive man. Yet somehow that door felt like it was protecting something. Outside, evening settled over Millfield. Michael locked the store and headed toward his motel. He fully intended to spend the next few days handling paperwork and deciding how quickly he could sell the property. At least, that had been the plan. But as he drove away, he found himself thinking less about selling the store and more about the locked room hidden in the back. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he had a feeling that whatever waited behind that door might be the real reason his uncle left the store to him. Michael woke earlier than necessary the next morning. The motel room was small and quiet, but sleep had been difficult. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself thinking about the locked office at the back of the store. It made no sense. Raymond had always been practical, organized, the kind of man who labeled boxes and balanced receipts down to the last cent. Yet somehow he had left behind a room nobody could enter. By 7:30, Michael was walking down Main Street carrying a cup of coffee. Morning sunlight painted the brick buildings in soft shades of gold. Millfield was already awake. The bakery smelled of fresh bread. A delivery truck unloaded supplies outside the pharmacy. Several older residents sat on benches talking about weather as if it were breaking news. Small-town life moved differently. Slower. More deliberate. Michael wasn't sure whether he liked it or not. As he approached the general store, he noticed someone standing on the porch. A woman in her 60s sorting mail into a leather satchel. She looked up immediately. "You must be Raymond's nephew," Michael laughed. "Is there anyone in this town who doesn't know that?" The woman smiled. "Not anymore." She extended her hand. "Ruth Parker, postmaster." Michael shook it. Ruth glanced toward the store. "Strange seeing someone unlock that door again. Has it been closed long?" "Almost 2 years." Michael frowned. "Nobody bought it?" Ruth laughed softly. "Nobody wanted it." That answer matched what the attorney had implied. The building had sat on the market without attracting serious interest. Yet Michael noticed something odd. Despite saying nobody wanted the store, everyone seemed interested in what happened to it. People slowed down while passing. Several waved toward him. Others peeked through the windows. It was as if the building still mattered, even if nobody wanted to own it. Inside, Michael spent the morning cleaning. Dust coated nearly every shelf. Expired products filled several aisles. Old inventory occupied the stockroom. The work was tedious, but strangely satisfying. Each cleared shelf revealed a little more of the store's former charm. Around 10 o'clock, the front door opened. A broad-shouldered man carrying a toolbox stepped inside. "You Michael?" he asked. "Depends who's asking." The man grinned. "Frank Dawson." He pointed toward the toolbox. "I fix things around town." Michael nodded. "Nice to meet you." Frank glanced around the store. "Looks better already." "That's generous." "No. Generous would have been saying it looked good." Michael laughed. Within minutes, Frank was helping him move shelves and inspect electrical wiring. The man seemed to know every inch of the building. Eventually, Michael asked the obvious question. "You work for my uncle?" Frank nodded. Off and on for 20 years. Then maybe you can answer something. Frank immediately looked suspicious. Depends on the question. Michael pointed toward the back hallway. What's behind the locked office? For the first time. Frank hesitated. Just slightly, but enough for Michael to notice. Never been inside. Seriously? Seriously. Michael folded his arms. You worked here 20 years. Frank shrugged. Raymond kept that room private. Why? Never asked. The answer felt incomplete. Not exactly dishonest, just incomplete. Before Michael could push further, the front door opened again. This time, an elderly woman entered carrying a basket of homemade muffins. For the workers, she announced. Within minutes, 2 more locals appeared. Then another. Then another. By lunchtime, the supposedly forgotten store contained half a dozen people chatting near the counter. Michael watched in amazement. Nobody came to shop. The store wasn't even open. They came because the building was open. The distinction fascinated him. Throughout the afternoon, stories about Raymond surfaced naturally. Some remembered him extending credit during difficult times. Others recalled him staying open during snowstorms when nearby towns shut down. One farmer mentioned that Raymond once drove 50 miles to deliver supplies during a flood. The stories painted a consistent picture. Raymond had been dependable, steady, generous. Yet one thing seemed missing. Nobody talked about his personal life, his hobbies, his family, his ambitions. Every story focused on what he did for other people. Late in the afternoon, Walter appeared carrying an old photograph. Thought you might want this. Michael accepted it carefully. The image showed the store decades earlier. The parking lot was full. Customers crowded the porch. Children stood holding ice cream cones. At the center of the photograph stood Raymond, smiling beside the front door. Business looks good. Walter nodded. Used to be the heart of town. Michael studied the image. Something caught his attention. Beside Raymond stood another man he didn't recognize. The two appeared close. Friends, perhaps. Who's this? Walter looked at the photograph and became unexpectedly quiet. That's Henry Lawson. What happened to him? Walter stared at the picture a moment longer. Moved away. The answer arrived too quickly, too neatly. Michael immediately suspected there was more to the story. Before he could ask another question, Walter carefully took the photograph back and pointed toward the office hallway. You ever get that room open? Not yet. Walter nodded slowly. You might find some answers in there. Then he walked away. Michael stood motionless for several seconds. Answers. Not records, not paperwork. Answers. The choice of words felt deliberate. As evening approached, Frank finished repairing several lights near the stockroom. Before leaving, he handed Michael a small ring of keys. Found these in an old storage cabinet. Michael examined them. Most looked ordinary. One didn't. A small brass key sat attached to a faded tag. The tag's writing had nearly disappeared with age, but one word remained visible. Office. Michael's pulse quickened immediately. He looked toward the hallway, then back at the key. Frank noticed his expression and smiled. Looks like tomorrow just got more interesting. After everyone left, Michael locked the front door and stood alone inside the store. The building felt different now, less abandoned, more alive. The conversations, the visitors, the stories. All of it suggested the general store held more importance than anyone admitted. Slowly, He walked toward the locked office at the back. The brass key felt heavy in his hand. He stopped in front of the door and studied the old lock. Tomorrow would be soon enough. Yet as he stood there staring at the keyhole, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited inside wasn't merely a room. It was the beginning of a mystery his uncle had spent years protecting. Michael arrived at the store carrying the brass key in his pocket and far more curiosity than he wanted to admit. The morning air felt cooler than the previous day. Sunlight stretched across Main Street as local businesses opened for another day. A few residents waved as he walked past. He still found it strange how quickly people recognized him. In the city, he could live beside someone for years without learning their name. In Millfield, it seemed impossible to remain anonymous for more than 24 hours. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar bell rang overhead. For a moment, he simply stood there listening to the quiet. Then his eyes drifted toward the hallway at the back of the store. The locked office waited exactly where he had left it. The brass key felt heavier than it should have. "No point putting it off," he muttered. He walked down the hallway and stopped in front of the door. The lock looked worn from decades of use. Slowly, he inserted the key. It fit perfectly. His pulse quickened. He turned it. The mechanism clicked immediately. No resistance, no struggle, almost as if the door had been waiting for him. Michael wrapped his hand around the knob and pushed. The hinges creaked softly. Dust floated through the beam of sunlight entering from a small window inside. He stepped into the room. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. A desk sat against one wall. Filing cabinets occupied another. Shelves held binders, ledgers, and boxes. The office looked frozen in time, exactly like the rest of the store. Yet something felt different, more personal, more deliberate. Unlike the public areas, every item here appeared carefully arranged. Michael moved toward the desk. A reading lamp sat beside an old calculator. Several pencils remained organized inside a wooden cup. A calendar still hung on the wall. The final date marked was nearly 2 years old, the day before Raymond passed away. Michael stared at it for several seconds. The sight felt unexpectedly emotional. His uncle had likely sat here during his final weeks, handling paperwork and organizing records. The thought made the room feel less like an office and more like a final message waiting to be read. He spent the next hour exploring. Most files contained ordinary business information: supplier invoices, tax records, inventory lists, exactly what he expected. Then he opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside rested a photograph. The same man from Walter's old picture. Henry Lawson. This time the image was clearer. Henry and Raymond stood together in front of the store many years earlier. Both were smiling. Friends. Close friends. Michael flipped the photograph over. A handwritten note covered the back. "Some debts can't be repaid with money. Raymond." Michael frowned. The message felt important, but he couldn't explain why. He carefully set the photograph aside. Around mid-morning, the front bell rang. A moment later, Ruth appeared in the office doorway. "Thought I might find you here." Michael laughed. "Am I that predictable?" Ruth looked around the room. "Actually, yes." She stepped inside, slowly. "First time anybody's opened this office since Raymond died." Michael noticed her studying the shelves. "Did he spend a lot of time here?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Every day." "Doing paperwork?" Ruth hesitated. "Among other things." There it was again, Another answer that felt incomplete. Michael was beginning to suspect the entire town had mastered the art of withholding information. After Ruth left, he returned to searching. Several filing cabinets contained decades of records. Most were mundane. Yet one cabinet stood out immediately. Unlike the others, it remained locked. Michael tried every key on the ring. None fit. Curious, he examined the cabinet more closely. The lock appeared newer than everything else in the room. Not modern, just newer. Someone had replaced it at some point. Why secure only one cabinet? The question lingered while he continued exploring. By lunchtime, he decided to take a break. The diner across the street served decent food and even better conversation. Walter occupied a corner booth exactly where Michael expected to find him. "Let me guess," Walter said. "You opened the office." Michael sat down. "How does everybody know everything around here?" Walter grinned. "Practice." Michael ordered coffee and a sandwich before getting straight to the point. "Who was Henry Lawson?" The old man's smile disappeared. Not completely, just enough for Michael to notice. "Friend of your uncle." "That's it." Walter stirred his coffee. "For a long time." "What happened to him?" Silence followed. Finally, Walter looked out the window. "Sometimes people leave." "Why?" "Sometimes because they have to." Michael leaned back. Another incomplete answer, yet something about Walter's reaction confirmed his suspicion. Henry Lawson mattered. A lot. Back at the store later that afternoon, Michael focused on cleaning. The work gave him time to think. Shelf by shelf, the building slowly improved. Dust disappeared, floors brightened, old displays became visible again. To his surprise, several customers actually wandered inside. Not many, just enough to keep him occupied. An elderly farmer purchased work gloves. A teenager bought bottled water. A mother stopped in for batteries. The sales were small, but they proved something important. The store wasn't dead. It was neglected. There was a difference. Around 4 o'clock, while reorganizing shelves behind the counter, Michael discovered an old maintenance panel hidden near the floor. Most people would never notice it. The wooden cover blended almost perfectly with the wall. Curious, he opened it. Inside sat a narrow compartment, barely large enough to hold documents. The space was empty except for a folded piece of paper. His pulse immediately quickened. Carefully, he unfolded it. The paper contained only a short, handwritten note. "If you're reading this, you finally opened the office." Michael stared at the message. The handwriting belonged to Raymond. There was no doubt. Beneath the sentence appeared a simple instruction. "Start with the red ledger." His heart began beating faster. Red ledger. He looked around the office. Hundreds of books occupied the shelves. Most were black, some blue, a few green. Then he noticed one sitting alone on the highest shelf near the window. Dark red, almost hidden, almost impossible to see unless you were specifically looking for it. Slowly, Michael crossed the room and removed the ledger from the shelf. Dust covered the binding. The book felt surprisingly heavy. For several seconds, he simply held it. Whatever Raymond wanted him to find had been waiting here for years. Then he opened the cover. The first page contained no business records, no inventory, no accounting information. Instead, a single handwritten sentence appeared in the center of the page. "For those who needed help when nobody else was watching." Michael stared at the words, then turned the page and immediately realized this was not a business ledger at all. Michael sat alone in the office, long after the store closed, staring at the open red ledger. Outside, dusk settled over Millfield. The last rays of sunlight faded from the windows, leaving the room illuminated only by the desk lamp. He had expected financial records, inventory lists, maybe old business accounts. Instead, the first few pages contained names. Dozens of names, each followed by dates, dollar amounts, and brief handwritten notes. The entries looked nothing like standard bookkeeping. April 12, 1994. Mortgage payment. Family requested anonymity. June 3, 1995. Medical expenses covered. No repayment expected. September 8, 1996. School tuition assistance approved. Michael frowned. Approved by who? The deeper he read, the stranger the ledger became. Every page documented money leaving the store, not as business expenses, as private assistance, quiet support, anonymous help. He flipped through several years of entries. The pattern never changed. Names, amounts, notes, hundreds of them. Sometimes the sums were small, a utility bill, a grocery voucher, a repair expense. Other times they were substantial. Mortgage payments, hospital bills, emergency loans that were apparently never repaid. By the time he finally closed the book, one fact had become obvious. Over several decades, tens of thousands of dollars had disappeared from the store's profits, and nobody seemed to know. The following morning, Michael arrived at the store carrying more questions than answers. The red ledger rested safely inside his backpack. He considered showing it to someone, then decided against it. Not yet. Until he understood what he was looking at, discretion felt wiser. The day began normally enough. Customers drifted in and out. Most purchases were small, a bag of feed, batteries, coffee. Yet Michael noticed something encouraging. Traffic had increased since he started cleaning the store. People seemed curious, interested. The building was becoming part of daily life again. Around mid-morning, Ruth stopped by to drop off mail. Michael watched her sort envelopes behind the counter. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Ruth smiled. "Depends." Was my uncle wealthy? The question caught her off guard. "Raymond." "Yes." Ruth laughed softly. "Not even close." That answer matched Michael's expectations. The store generated income, but hardly enough to make someone rich, which only deepened the mystery. Where did all the money in the ledger come from? Later that afternoon, Michael returned to the office and continued studying the entries. One name appeared repeatedly over several years: Sarah Holloway. Curious, he checked additional pages. More references, medical bills, utility payments, educational expenses. Whoever Sarah Holloway was, Raymond had helped her for a long time. Michael wrote the name down. Then another. Then another. By the end of the hour, he had a list of 6 people who appeared throughout the ledger. The entries spanned decades, yet many of the names sounded familiar because he had seen them around town. The realization immediately caught his attention. Some of these people were still living in Millfield. Around 3 o'clock, Walter entered the store carrying a newspaper. Like always, he wandered directly toward the coffee counter. Michael decided to take a chance. "Walter?" The old man looked up. "Yeah?" Michael held up his notebook. "Do you know Sarah Holloway?" Walter's reaction was immediate, not dramatic, just noticeable. A slight pause, a brief narrowing of the eyes. Why? Michael shrugged casually. Name came up. Walter studied him for several seconds, then nodded toward the street. Lives 3 blocks north. Michael leaned forward. Was she close to Raymond? Walter stirred his coffee slowly. Everybody was close to Raymond. There it was again. Another answer that wasn't really an answer. Yet Michael had already learned that people in Millfield rarely lied. They simply chose what to reveal. After closing the store, curiosity finally won. He drove to the address Walter mentioned. The house was modest but well-maintained. Flower beds lined the walkway. Children's bicycles rested near the porch. The place felt lived in, happy. Michael almost turned around. Showing up unannounced felt awkward. Then he reminded himself he was investigating something important. He knocked. A woman in her 50s answered. "Can I help you?" Michael introduced himself. The moment he mentioned Raymond's name, her expression softened. "Raymond Carter?" she asked. "You knew him?" Sarah laughed quietly. Everyone knew Raymond. She invited him inside. Family photographs covered the walls. Graduation pictures, birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings. The house radiated warmth. After several minutes of conversation, Michael finally explained why he came. He mentioned finding her name among old records. Sarah became very quiet. "Records?" she asked. Michael nodded. "I think Raymond may have helped some people over the years." Sarah stared at the floor, then toward a photograph resting on a nearby shelf. Finally, she smiled sadly. "Helped," she whispered. "That's one way to describe it." For the next hour, she told him a story he had never expected to hear. 20 years earlier, her husband suffered a serious injury. Medical bills accumulated rapidly. They nearly lost their home. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table one evening, trying to figure out which bills could wait another month. The next morning, a bank representative called. Their overdue mortgage had been paid in full. Michael leaned forward. "You knew who did it." Sarah nodded slowly. "Eventually, Raymond." Tears formed in her eyes. "He made me promise never to tell anyone." Michael sat in silence. The story matched the ledger perfectly. One entry, one payment, one life changed. Before leaving, he asked a final question. "Why keep it secret?" Sarah smiled. "Because he didn't want gratitude." She looked around the room. He wanted people to keep moving forward. The drive back to the store felt different. The ledger was no longer an abstract mystery. It was personal. Every entry represented a real person, a real struggle, a real turning point. Yet the biggest question remained unanswered. Why had Raymond done it? Why dedicate decades to quietly helping people without recognition? Back inside the office, Michael reopened the red ledger. This time he paid attention to the notes rather than the dollar amounts. Several entries contained small symbols beside certain names. Tiny circles, triangles, stars. Most appeared random. Then he noticed something unusual. Every person he had spoken with carried the same symbol, a small star drawn in the margin. Curious. He flipped forward. More stars appeared, more names. Then, near the middle of the book, he found a folded piece of paper tucked between 2 pages. His pulse quickened. Carefully unfolding it, he discovered a handwritten list. 23 names, every one marked with a star. At the top of the page, Raymond had written a single sentence. Start here if you want to understand why the ledger exists. Michael stared at the list. 23 names, 23 stories, and somewhere among them was the secret his uncle had spent a lifetime protecting. Michael spent the next 2 days thinking about the list hidden inside the ledger. 23 names, 23 people marked with the same small star. Raymond's note continued replaying in his mind. Start here if you want to understand why the ledger exists. The sentence suggested these people weren't random. They were connected somehow. The challenge was figuring out how. He began with the simplest approach possible. He started asking questions. Not obvious questions, careful ones. Small-town conversations tended to work better that way. Every morning, more customers wandered into the store. Some bought supplies. Others stopped by simply because the lights were on again. Michael noticed something interesting. The cleaner and more organized the store became, the longer people stayed. They lingered near the coffee machine, shared stories, caught up on local news. The old general store seemed to be reclaiming its place at the center of town. One morning, Ruth entered carrying a stack of mail and immediately frowned. "You moved the seed display." Michael looked up. "You noticed?" Everybody noticed. She pointed toward the front window. "Looks better there." Michael laughed. "That's the closest thing to a compliment you've ever given me." Ruth smiled and handed him a package. Then her eyes landed on the notebook resting beside the register. The list of names remained tucked inside. "Research?" she asked. Michael hesitated. "Something like that." Ruth studied him for a moment. "You're trying to figure out what Raymond was doing." It wasn't a question. Michael nodded slowly. "Maybe." Ruth surprised him by sitting down. "Good luck." "That's not encouraging." It wasn't meant to be. She glanced around the store. People protected his privacy when he was alive. Some still do. After she left, Michael considered her words carefully. Protected his privacy. Not his reputation. His privacy. There was a difference. Around noon, Walter arrived carrying a sack of feed. Before leaving, he paused beside the counter. "You ever talk to Frank about Raymond?" Michael shook his hand. "Not really." Walter nodded toward the repair shop down the street. "You should." "Why?" Walter grinned. "Because Frank knows things." Then he walked out before offering further explanation. By now, Michael had accepted that everyone in Millfield communicated through riddles. Later that afternoon, he visited Frank's workshop. The repair shop smelled of oil, sawdust, and old machinery. Frank stood bent over a tractor engine when Michael arrived. "Let me guess," Frank said without looking up. "This is about the ledger." Michael froze. "How did you know?" Frank finally looked up and smiled. "Because everybody eventually asks about the ledger." That answer immediately caught Michael's attention. "Everybody?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag. "Anybody who got close to Raymond eventually figured out something strange was happening." Michael pulled out the list of names. "Do any of these people mean anything to you?" Frank studied the page. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. "Most of them." Michael sat down on a nearby stool. "What's the connection?" Frank leaned against the workbench. "Different stories." "That's not what I asked." Frank chuckled. "No, but it's the answer." He pointed toward one name. Martha Ellis lost her husband young. Another, David Turner, nearly lost the family farm. Another, Caroline Brooks, medical problems. Michael frowned. So they all needed help. Frank nodded, at some point, and Raymond helped them. Frank looked away briefly. Not exactly. That answer immediately raised more questions. What does that mean? For several seconds, Frank remained silent. Then he walked toward a shelf and retrieved an old photograph. The image showed a group of people standing outside the store roughly 30 years earlier. Michael immediately recognized Raymond. He also recognized several names from the list: Martha, David, Caroline, others. What am I looking at? Michael asked. Frank handed him the photograph. On the back, someone had written a date and 4 words: First Community Meeting. Michael stared at the message. Community meeting for what? Frank smiled faintly. That's the question, isn't it? The mystery deepened. The ledger wasn't just connected to Raymond. It involved multiple people, maybe many more than he realized. That evening, back at the store, Michael studied the photograph for nearly an hour. 23 people appeared in the image. 23 names appeared on the list. The connection seemed obvious. Then he noticed something else. Every person in the photograph stood around a large wooden table positioned on the store's porch. At the center sat a metal cash box. Curious. He flipped the image over again. A second note occupied the lower corner. Year 1. Michael's pulse quickened. Year 1. Of what? He immediately returned to the ledger. The earliest star-marked entries began the same year as the photograph. Not long afterward, assistance payments started appearing regularly. The timeline matched perfectly. Around closing time, while searching through office drawers, Michael found another clue. Tucked inside an old file folder rested several newspaper clippings. Most described difficult periods in the town's history: factory layoffs, drought years, flood damage, economic downturns. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Many matched the list. These weren't random people. They were people who had experienced hardship. Then he found something even stranger. A folded sheet of paper hidden between 2 clippings. The page contained a set of simple rules written in Raymond's handwriting. Rule 1. Nobody takes credit. Rule 2. Nobody discusses donations. Rule 3. Help quietly. Rule 4. Help quickly. Rule 5. Someday, help someone else. Michael read the list 3 times. Slowly. A picture began forming. The ledger wasn't documenting charity. It was documenting a system, a group, a network, something organized, something deliberate. Yet he still didn't understand its purpose. Then he noticed a final note written beneath the rules, a single sentence squeezed into the bottom margin. We started with 23. We ended up helping hundreds. Michael lowered the page and stared across the empty office. The room suddenly felt much larger. Hundreds. The ledger wasn't recording isolated acts of generosity. It was recording a movement hidden in plain sight for decades. And somewhere in the story of those original 23 people lay the reason Raymond spent nearly 40 years keeping it secret. Michael spent the next week balancing 2 completely different lives. During the day, he ran the general store. During the evenings, he investigated the mystery hidden inside Raymond's ledger. The strange thing was that both activities seemed connected. The more time he spent behind the counter, the more people opened up. The store wasn't simply a place to buy supplies. It was where news traveled, friendships formed, and stories survived. Every conversation seemed to reveal another small piece of Raymond's life, yet none of them fully explained the ledger. One rainy afternoon, while organizing inventory near the front entrance, Michael noticed a familiar name on a customer receipt. David Turner, one of the 23 names from the list. The farmer arrived an hour later driving an aging pickup truck covered in mud. He looked exactly like someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "Need feed and fencing wire," David announced. Michael loaded the supplies onto the counter. Then he decided to take a chance. "Can I ask you something?" David narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Depends." Michael pulled out the photograph from the community meeting. "You recognize anybody?" David stared at the image for several seconds. His expression softened. "Haven't seen this picture in years." "You were there?" David nodded slowly. "All of us were." Michael leaned forward. "What was the meeting about?" David looked toward the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. "Survival." The answer immediately captured Michael's attention. David paid for his supplies but didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter and began talking. 30 years earlier, Millfield had faced one of the worst economic crises in its history. Several businesses closed. Farms struggled. Families left town searching for work elsewhere. Some people lost homes. Others nearly did. "Everybody thought the town was finished," David said. Michael listened carefully. "And the 23 people in the photograph?" David smiled faintly. "The stubborn ones." Apparently, those 23 residents gathered inside the general store after a particularly difficult winter. Nobody had solutions. Nobody had money. What they did have was determination. Raymond organized the meeting. The purpose wasn't charity. It was cooperation. "If somebody needed help," David explained, "the rest of us pitched in." Michael frowned. "So the ledger tracked donations?" "Not exactly." David's answer carried the same frustrating ambiguity Michael had come to expect from everyone in Millfield. Before leaving, the farmer paused beside the door. "Talk to Martha Ellis." "Why?" David smiled. "She remembers more than I do." Then he disappeared into the rain. The following day, Michael visited Martha's flower shop. The building sat near the center of town, surrounded by colorful window displays. Inside, the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Martha herself appeared older than the photograph, but immediately recognizable. "You're Raymond's nephew," she said before he introduced himself. Michael laughed. "I'm starting to think my name isn't actually Michael anymore." Martha smiled. "Small town." After a few minutes of conversation, Michael showed her the photograph. Unlike David, she reacted emotionally. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "Goodness," she whispered. "Look at all of us." She gently touched several faces in the picture. Some people had moved away. Others had passed on. Yet she remembered every name. Michael eventually asked the same question. "What was the group?" Martha looked surprised. "Nobody told you?" "Apparently everybody assumed somebody else already did." Martha laughed softly. Then her expression became thoughtful. "The ledger wasn't about giving money away." Michael frowned. "Then what was it?" She pointed toward the photograph. "Hope." That answer sounded even more confusing. Fortunately, Martha elaborated. During the difficult years, Raymond and the others created an informal fund. Whenever someone could spare a few dollars, they contributed. When someone faced hardship, the group helped. But there was one important rule. The recipient could never know exactly who helped them. "Why?" Michael asked. Martha smiled sadly. "Pride." The word immediately made sense. Many people would refuse assistance if they knew neighbors were paying their bills. Anonymous help removed that obstacle. "The goal wasn't charity," Martha continued. "The goal was keeping people standing." Michael immediately thought about the rules hidden inside the office. Help quietly, help quickly. Suddenly they felt much more meaningful. Before leaving, Martha handed him a small envelope she had kept for years. "Raymond gave me this before he passed away." Michael stared at it. "Why didn't you open it?" Martha laughed. "Because it wasn't addressed to me." Sure enough, his name appeared on the front. Not in recent handwriting, older handwriting. Raymond must have prepared it years earlier. Michael waited until he returned to the store before opening it. The envelope contained a folded note and a key. Another key, smaller than the office key. Attached to it was a faded metal tag, "Filing Cabinet B." Michael immediately looked toward the locked cabinet in the office, the one none of his keys fit. His pulse quickened. The note contained only one sentence. "When you understand why we started, you'll be ready to understand what happened next." Michael read it twice, then a third time. What happened next? The phrase suggested the real story hadn't even begun yet. That evening, after closing the store, he carried the new key into the office. The locked filing cabinet stood exactly where he left it. For a moment, he simply stared at it. The mystery surrounding the ledger had already grown larger than expected. 23 people, decades of secret assistance, hundreds of lives helped. Yet Raymond's note implied something more remained hidden. Slowly, Michael inserted the key. The lock clicked immediately. His heartbeat accelerated. He pulled open the drawer. Inside sat dozens of folders arranged with remarkable precision. Most carried names, some carried dates. Then one file near the center caught his attention. Unlike the others, it wasn't labeled with a person's name. Instead, a single word appeared across the tab. Henry. Michael froze. Henry Lawson, the mysterious man from the photographs. The friend everyone seemed reluctant to discuss. Carefully, he pulled out the folder. A photograph slid onto the desk. It showed Henry and Raymond standing together in front of the store. Both looked younger, happier. On the back, someone had written a simple sentence. None of this would have existed without him. Michael stared at the words. Suddenly, the ledger wasn't just a mystery about Raymond anymore. It was becoming a mystery about Henry Lawson. And judging by the size of the folder, his story might explain everything. Michael sat alone in the office long after sunset, staring at the folder labeled Henry. Outside, Main Street had gone quiet. The occasional passing car was the only sound drifting through the store windows. The general store felt different at night. Older somehow, as if the building relaxed once everyone went home. He carefully opened the folder and immediately realized why people became uncomfortable whenever Henry Lawson's name came up. The file was thick, much thicker than any other folder in the cabinet. Photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, receipts, letters, and meeting records filled nearly every inch. Henry wasn't simply part of the story. He was at the center of it. The first photograph showed a much younger Raymond and Henry standing in front of the store during the early 1980s. Both men appeared proud of something. Behind them hung a banner reading, Millfield Community Fund. Michael frowned. It was the first time he had seen an actual name attached to the mysterious organization. He flipped through additional pages. More photographs appeared. Community dinners, fundraisers, volunteer projects, food drives. In nearly every image, Henry stood beside Raymond, sometimes organizing events, sometimes carrying supplies, sometimes simply talking with people. The pattern became obvious. Whatever the community fund had become, the two men built it together. Michael continued reading until he found a newspaper clipping dated almost 35 years earlier. The headline immediately caught his attention. Local factory announces closure. He recognized the event from earlier conversations. The factory shutdown had nearly destroyed the town's economy. Hundreds of jobs disappeared overnight. Families struggled. Businesses suffered. Michael scanned the article carefully. Then he noticed a handwritten note Raymond had scribbled in the margin. This is where it started. His pulse quickened. Finally, he was getting closer. The next few documents painted a clearer picture. After the factory closure, people began losing homes. Utility services were disconnected. Families skipped meals. Pride kept many from asking for help. Raymond and Henry refused to watch the town collapse. They started collecting donations quietly, small amounts at first. $5 here, $10 there. Nothing dramatic, but enough to help. Enough to buy groceries, pay heating bills, cover emergency expenses. Michael smiled as he imagined the two men sitting together at the store counter, planning ways to help neighbors without embarrassing them. It sounded exactly like the Raymond everyone described. Then the file took an unexpected turn. Several years after the community fund began, Henry's name suddenly disappeared from the records, not gradually, completely. One page he appeared everywhere, the next, nothing. Michael sat upright. That wasn't normal. He immediately searched for an explanation. 20 minutes later, he found it, buried inside an old envelope. The letter was addressed to Raymond. The handwriting belonged to Henry. Michael carefully unfolded it. Raymond, by the time you read this, I'll already be gone. The sentence instantly tightened something in his chest. He continued reading. Henry explained that doctors had discovered a serious illness, one with limited treatment options at the time. He didn't want people treating him differently. He didn't want sympathy. Most importantly, he didn't want the community fund to become distracted. Michael read every word slowly. The letter wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. If anything, it was surprisingly hopeful. Henry wrote about the people they had helped, the families who stayed in town, the businesses that survived, the children who eventually graduated and built lives of their own. Then he wrote something that stopped Michael completely. Promise me you'll keep it going, even if nobody ever knows we started it. Michael lowered the letter. Suddenly, everything made sense. The secrecy, the ledger, the rules, the refusal to accept credit. The community fund was never about recognition. It was about results. Henry and Raymond cared more about helping people than being thanked. Michael leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he felt like he understood the men behind the mystery. Around 9 o'clock, he finally locked the folder and headed home. Yet sleep remained difficult. The story kept replaying in his mind. Henry's illness, the promise, the decades of quiet work that followed. The next morning, he arrived at the store determined to learn more. To his surprise, Walter was already waiting outside. "You found Henry's file," the old man said immediately. Michael stopped. "How do you keep doing that?" Walter smiled. because I would have done the same thing." They entered the store together. Michael made coffee while Walter settled into his usual chair near the counter. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Walter finally broke the silence. "Henry was my friend too." Michael looked up. The old man rarely volunteered personal information. "What was he like?" Walter smiled at the memory. "Annoyingly optimistic." Michael laughed. "Sounds familiar." Walter nodded. "Every time something went wrong, Henry convinced everybody things would work out." He glanced around the store. Most of us didn't believe him. "But Raymond did." Walter smiled. "Always." The conversation continued throughout the morning. For the first time, Walter spoke openly. He described community meetings, volunteer projects, fundraisers, long nights spent trying to solve problems no one else wanted to face. The more Michael listened, the more one realization became unavoidable. The community fund had never been about money. Money was simply a tool. The real goal was preserving hope, preserving the town itself. Just before lunch, Walter pointed toward the office. "Did you find the map?" Michael frowned. "What map?" The old man immediately looked surprised. Then he laughed softly. "Guess you haven't finished the file yet." Michael's curiosity returned instantly. "There's a map." Walter stood up and headed for the door. "Ask Raymond." "That's difficult." Walter grinned. "Then check the last section." Before Michael could ask another question, the old man disappeared outside. The moment the door closed, Michael headed back to the office. He reopened Henry's folder and flipped toward the final section. Several pages later, he found a folded document hidden inside a plastic sleeve. Carefully unfolding it, he discovered an old map of Millfield. Dozens of locations were marked in red ink. Houses, farms, businesses, community buildings. Along the bottom margin, Raymond had written a short note. "Every red mark represents a life that changed because someone cared enough to help." Michael stared at the map in silence. Then his eyes widened. There weren't dozens of red marks. There were hundreds. And suddenly he realized the true scale of what Raymond and Henry had built over the years. The ledger wasn't documenting a handful of good deeds. It was documenting the invisible foundation that had kept an entire town standing for nearly 4 decades. Michael couldn't stop looking at the map. It covered nearly the entire desk. Red marks stretched across every part of Millfield and the surrounding countryside. Farms, homes, businesses, community buildings. The sheer number was overwhelming. For weeks, he had imagined the ledger documented a handful of generous acts. Now he realized he had been thinking far too small. The map represented decades of lives quietly changed by people who believed helping others mattered. He spent nearly an hour tracing locations with his finger. Some addresses belonged to people he already knew. Others meant nothing to him. Yet each red mark represented a story. A crisis survived, a family stabilized, a future protected. Eventually, he noticed something else. Certain locations had circles drawn around them. Unlike the ordinary red marks, these circles appeared deliberate, important. There were only 7 of them. Curious. Michael flipped through the remainder of Henry's file, searching for an explanation. Near the back, he found a folded sheet labeled Legacy Sites. His pulse quickened immediately. The 7 circled locations all appeared on the list. The first was the church. The second, the school. The third, the town library. The remaining 4 included several businesses and one abandoned property outside town. Michael frowned. Why would those places matter more than the others? Before he could investigate further, the bell above the front door rang. He quickly tucked the documents away and returned to the store. The morning passed busily. More customers arrived than usual. Word had spread that the store was improving. Several people commented on the cleaner shelves. Others appreciated the expanded inventory. One older couple even thanked him for reopening because they no longer needed to drive 20 miles for basic supplies. The gratitude surprised him. He hadn't realized how important the store remained. Around noon, Ruth entered carrying mail. "You're smiling more lately," she observed. Michael laughed. "I didn't realize people were keeping score." "Small town." She placed several envelopes on the counter. "We notice things." As she turned to leave, Michael stopped her. "Do you know anything about the old library?" Ruth looked back. "Of course." "Why is it important?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Important to who?" "To Raymond." Ruth studied him carefully. "You're following the map." It wasn't a question. Michael nodded. Her expression softened immediately. "Then go visit the library." "That's not an answer." Ruth smiled. "It's the right answer." Then she walked out by now. Michael had accepted that direct information simply wasn't part of Millfield's culture. That afternoon, he closed the store an hour early and headed toward the library. The building sat near the edge of town, small, brick, modest, yet surprisingly well-maintained. Inside, rows of shelves stretched beneath warm lighting. A woman in her 70s looked up from behind the front desk. "Can I help you?" Michael introduced himself. The reaction was immediate. "Raymond's nephew." Michael laughed. "Again?" The woman smiled. "I'm Eleanor." She gestured toward a nearby chair. "You came because of the map?" Apparently, everyone knew more than he did. Eleanor disappeared briefly into a back room before returning with a thick scrapbook. She placed it on the table. "Start there." Michael opened the first page. Photographs covered nearly every sheet. Children reading books, community events, educational programs. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed several newspaper articles describing financial difficulties, funding shortages, potential closure, budget cuts. One headline stood out. "Town Library faces permanent shut-up." The article dated back nearly 20 years. Michael looked up. "What happened?" Eleanor smiled. "We're still here." "Obviously." "Because somebody stepped in." Michael already knew where this was heading. "Raymond." Eleanor shook her head. "Not exactly." Then she explained. When the library nearly closed, anonymous donations began arriving, small amounts initially, then larger contributions, enough to cover operating costs, enough to keep programs running, enough to save the building. Michael listened carefully. The story sounded familiar. Very familiar. Another crisis, another anonymous solution, another red mark on the map. Before leaving, Eleanor handed him a photograph from the scrapbook. It showed several children standing outside the library years earlier. Among them stood a teenage girl holding a stack of books. "That's my granddaughter," Eleanor said. "First person in our family to attend college." Michael smiled. The library helped. Eleanor nodded. The library survived, so she had somewhere to learn. The connection hit him immediately. Raymond and Henry hadn't simply helped individuals. They protected institutions, places that gave entire communities opportunities. The realization changed everything. On his way back to the store, Michael visited two additional locations from the map, the church and the school. Both revealed similar stories: anonymous support, quiet intervention, problems solved before becoming disasters. The pattern continued everywhere. By evening, his understanding had evolved dramatically. The community fund wasn't reactive. It wasn't simply paying bills. It was preserving the foundations of the town itself. Back at the office, Michael reopened the map. The red marks no longer looked random. They formed a network. Families, businesses, community spaces, opportunities. Hope. Every mark connected to something larger than a single person. Then his eyes drifted toward the final location on the legacy sites list: the abandoned property outside town. Unlike the others, Michael recognized neither the address nor the name attached to it. What caught his attention even more was the note written beside it in Raymond's handwriting. "Start here if you want the full story." Michael stared at the sentence. He had already uncovered decades of secrets, yet apparently the biggest one still waited. He looked out the office window toward the darkening town. Somewhere beyond the fields sat an abandoned property important enough for Raymond to highlight among hundreds of locations. And if the note was correct, whatever happened there might explain the true origin of the ledger, the fund, and everything that followed. The next morning, Michael left before sunrise. The address attached to the final location on the legacy sites list sat folded in his jacket pocket. He had barely slept. Every clue seemed to point toward the abandoned property outside town. Raymond's note had been unmistakable. "Start here if you want the full story." After everything he had already uncovered, Michael couldn't ignore a message like that. The road leading out of Millfield wound through open farmland and rolling hills. Morning fog hovered above fields still wet from the previous night's rain. The farther he drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Eventually, a narrow gravel road branched away from the highway. A rusted mailbox stood beside it. The faded name still remained barely visible: Lawson Farm. Michael immediately tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Lawson. Henry Lawson. His pulse quickened. 10 minutes later, he arrived at the property. The farmhouse sat alone at the end of the road. Time had not been kind to it. Paint peeled from the walls. Several windows were boarded over. The barn leaned noticeably to one side. Weeds covered much of the yard. Yet despite the neglect, the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt remembered, as if someone had simply stopped time there. Michael stepped out of the truck and looked around. The silence felt almost complete. Wind rustled through nearby trees. Somewhere in the distance, birds called across the fields. Nothing else moved. He approached the farmhouse slowly. The front porch creaked beneath his weight. The door was locked. That didn't surprise him. What did surprise him was the small metal box mounted beside the frame. Curious. He opened it. Inside sat a single key and a folded note. The handwriting belonged to Raymond. Of course it did. Michael laughed softly. Somehow his uncle always seemed one step ahead. He unfolded the paper. "If you've come this far, you deserve to know why all of this started." The key opened the front door. Inside, dust covered nearly every surface, but the house remained remarkably intact. Furniture still occupied the living room. Family photographs lined shelves. Books rested exactly where someone left them decades earlier. Michael moved carefully through the rooms. The house felt personal in a way the general store never had. This wasn't a business. This was someone's life. On the wall above the fireplace hung a large photograph of Henry Lawson, younger than in most pictures Michael had seen. Beside him stood a woman and 2 children. A family. The image stopped him cold. Nobody had ever mentioned Henry's family. Why? He continued exploring. Eventually, he found a small study near the back of the house. The room contained a desk, several filing cabinets, and dozens of journals arranged neatly on shelves. His heart immediately began racing. He recognized the setup. It looked very similar to Raymond's office. Henry had kept records too. The first journal he opened dated back nearly 40 years. The entries weren't about money. They weren't about the community fund. They were about the town itself. Factory closures, struggling farms, families leaving in search of work, local businesses shutting down. Henry documented every setback, every challenge, every hardship facing Millfield. Michael read for nearly an hour. Then he reached an entry that changed everything. Today I watched another family leave town. That's the 7th this month. If this continues, Millfield won't survive another decade. Michael sat back. Suddenly he understood the urgency behind everything Henry and Raymond had built. The community fund wasn't created simply to help individuals. It was created to save the town. The realization transformed the entire story. Another journal contained meeting notes, early plans, lists of ideas. Most had been crossed out. Yet one sentence appeared repeatedly. Keep people here long enough for hope to return. Michael read the line 3 times. It perfectly explained the fund's philosophy. Help wasn't intended to solve every problem permanently. It was intended to buy time. Enough time for people to recover. Enough time for opportunities to return. Enough time for hope. Then he discovered the final journal. Unlike the others, it sat alone inside a wooden box. The cover carried a simple label, "For Raymond." Michael opened it carefully. The entries began shortly after Henry learned about his illness. The tone changed immediately. Less focused on the town, more reflective, more personal. Henry wrote about friendship, community, legacy. He worried about what would happen after he was gone. Not to himself, to Millfield. Then, near the end, Michael found the answer to the biggest mystery of all. Why keep everything secret? Henry's explanation was surprisingly simple. Because people accept kindness more easily when it doesn't come with attention. Michael smiled. It sounded exactly like everything he had learned so far. Yet the final pages held something even more important. Tucked inside the back cover rested a letter addressed directly to Raymond. Michael read every word slowly. Henry thanked his friend for believing in the mission, for continuing the work, for helping people long after he was gone. Then came the final paragraph. If the fund ever becomes about us, it will fail. If it remains about them, it will last forever. Michael lowered the letter and stared out the study window. Beyond the glass stretched fields that Henry once fought to protect. Families, businesses, schools, churches. Entire lives connected to decisions made inside this house decades earlier. Then he noticed one final item hidden beneath the letter. A photograph. The original 23 members of the community fund stood together outside the general store. Younger, determined, hopeful. On the back, Henry had written a final message. We never saved the town. The town saved itself. We just reminded people they weren't alone. Tears formed unexpectedly in Michael's eyes. For several minutes, he simply sat there holding the photograph. Finally, After weeks of searching, he understood the true story. The ledger wasn't about money. It wasn't about Raymond. It wasn't even about Henry. It was about ordinary people refusing to let each other fall. And suddenly, Michael knew exactly what he needed to do next. Michael returned to Millfield just before sunset. The photograph from Henry's farmhouse rested on the passenger seat beside him. 23 faces stared back from another era. Ordinary people, farmers, teachers, store owners, mechanics, parents. None of them looked like heroes, yet together they had quietly shaped the future of an entire town. As he drove through Main Street, the buildings looked different than they had a few weeks earlier. Not because they had changed, because he finally understood what they represented. Every storefront, every house, every community building carried traces of decisions made decades ago by people who refused to let one another fail. The realization stayed with him throughout the evening. The next morning, Michael unlocked the general store earlier than usual. Sunlight poured through the front windows, illuminating shelves he had spent weeks cleaning and restoring. The building felt alive now. Customers arrived steadily. Neighbors lingered over coffee. Children stopped by after school. The store had become busy again. Not crowded, just connected. Exactly the way Raymond would have wanted. Around noon, Michael made a decision. He walked into the office, retrieved the red ledger, the map, and several photographs, then carried everything to the front counter. If the story belonged to the town deserved to hear it. Over the next several days, he invited people to stop by after closing. Word spread quickly. On Friday evening, nearly every chair inside the store was occupied. Ruth sat near the front. Frank leaned against a shelf. Martha, Walter, Eleanor, David, and dozens of others filled the room. Some had known Raymond for years. Others barely remembered Henry. Yet everyone understood something important was about to happen. Michael stood behind the counter and looked around. For a moment, he felt nervous. Then he remembered the photograph from the farmhouse. 23 people had once gathered in this very building to help each other through difficult times. He could handle speaking to a room full of neighbors. He began with the ledger, then the map, then Henry's letters. The room remained completely silent as he explained everything he had discovered. The community fund, the anonymous assistants, the families who stayed, the businesses that survived, the institutions that endured because somebody quietly stepped in when help was needed most. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply nodded. They already knew pieces of the story. Michael was finally showing them the entire picture. Then he revealed the photograph of the original 23 members. Walter stared at it for a long time. "I haven't seen this in 30 years, he whispered. Martha smiled through tears. "Look how young we were." Laughter spread through the room. The kind of laughter that appears when people remember difficult times they somehow survived. As the evening continued, something unexpected happened. People started sharing stories, one by one. A woman revealed how her family nearly lost their farm. A retired teacher described receiving anonymous support during a medical emergency. A former student explained how a scholarship changed the course of her life. Each story connected to another, then another, then another. By the end of the night, Michael realized the ledger documented far more than financial assistance. It documented hope. Every entry represented a moment when someone refused to give up because help arrived at exactly the right time. Before everyone left, Michael showed them Henry's final message. "We never saved the town. The town saved itself. We just reminded people they weren't alone." The room fell silent again. Nobody seemed eager to leave after that. Eventually, Walter stood and looked around. "You know what Raymond would say if he were here?" Several people smiled. "What?" Frank asked. Walter pointed toward the crowd. "He'd tell us to stop talking about him." Laughter filled the store once more. Over the following months, the general store continued evolving. Michael added new inventory, expanded services, repaired sections of the building that had been neglected for years. Yet the biggest change wasn't physical. He dedicated a small section near the office to the history of the community fund. Not a monument, not a museum, just photographs, letters, and stories preserving what Raymond, Henry, and the others had built. People contributed memories. Old photographs appeared from attics and storage boxes. New stories surfaced regularly. The collection grew. So did the sense of pride surrounding it. One afternoon, nearly a year after arriving in Millfield, Michael found himself standing alone inside the store after closing. The last customer had gone home. The lights glowed warmly across the polished floor. Outside, evening settled over town. He walked into the office and opened the red ledger one final time. The pages looked different now, less mysterious, more meaningful. He understood every name, every note, every symbol. At the back of the book, tucked into the final page, he discovered something he had somehow overlooked. A small envelope. His name appeared on the front. Michael. The handwriting belonged to Raymond. Smiling, he opened it carefully. Inside rested a single sheet of paper. The message was short. "If you're reading this, then you stayed longer than you planned." Michael laughed softly. Raymond knew him too well. He continued reading. The note thanked him for giving the store a chance, not because the building mattered, because the people did. Then came the final sentence. "Some people inherit property. You inherited responsibility." Michael lowered the letter and looked around the office. For a long moment, he simply sat there, thinking about everything that had happened. A year earlier, he arrived planning to sell the store as quickly as possible. Now he couldn't imagine leaving. The general store wasn't valuable because of the building. It was valuable because of what it represented. Community, persistence, kindness, hope. He switched off the office light and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, he glanced back one final time. Shelves stood neatly organized. The coffee station waited for tomorrow's customers. Photographs of Raymond and Henry hung near the counter. The old store felt exactly as it should. Alive. Michael locked the door and stepped outside. Across Main Street, lights glowed from homes and businesses that still existed because ordinary people once chose to help one another. The town was still standing, not because of one man, not because of one ledger, but because generations of neighbors believed nobody should face hard times alone. And as Michael walked toward his truck beneath the evening sky, he realized that was the real inheritance Raymond had left behind. Not a store, not a building. A reminder that the strongest communities are built by people who care when nobody is watching.